Hello there, my name's Gary Sims from Android Authority. Now you probably use encryption every single day. If you have a TV or cable service that's bringing content down to your house, then probably some of those channels are encrypted so that only people who pay for the right channels can get the content. If you ever connect to a website that asks for your username and password, then that's probably an encrypted connection. Even if you create a zip file with a password on it, that again is encryption. There are loads and loads of examples of encryption every single day in our lives, and most of the time we don't even think about it. But if we just stop and think, we can ask ourselves the question, how does encryption work? How is it keeping all of my bank details safe? How is it keeping all of my personal information safe? Well, let me explain. So the first question, of course, is what is encryption? Encryption is a process of taking normal information, let's say text, and turning it into a version that can't be read by other people. Now, to do that conversion, you need a key, and the analogy here is like a key that you put into a lock to open a door. Once you have the key, you can unlock, which is decrypt that information. Without the key, it remains locked. As the Tom Jericho character put it in that great film Enigma, it turns plain text messages into gobbledygook.
It turns plain text messages into gobbledygook. The problem is the machine has 150 million ways of doing it.
Now, of course, the advantages of having things encrypted are enormous. If you want to send something like bank details today, you don't want a cyber thief, cyber criminal to be able to take that information and spend money on your credit card. Of course, encryption is used by governments, it's been used in warfare, it's used by all manner of different things. Now, the art of secret writing has been around for several thousand years, but of course the most famous example is from Julius Caesar. He wanted to write some secret messages to Cicero, and to do so he used this thing we call today the Caesar cipher. Now, it works like this. If you take the alphabet, A, B, C, D, all the way through to Z, and then underneath it you place another alphabet, but rather than placing A under A or B under B, you shift the bottom alphabet to the left or to the right by a few characters. Now, here's an example for us. I've shifted the alphabet to the right by 3. Now, if I wanted to encrypt the word hello, what I do is I look up H on the top row, and then I see what character is beneath it on the bottom row. In this case, it's an E. I then look up E for hello, the second letter of hello, and I look again to see what's below it, and I get a B. I then look up the L and I get I, and then look up L again and I get I, and then finally look up O and I get L. And now this word that we have here is not the word hello, it's just complete gibberish. So someone else seeing that wouldn't know what the message was. Now, the great thing is that if we shift the alphabet by 5 characters rather than by 3, we now get a different result. So H becomes C, E becomes Z, L becomes G, L becomes G, and O becomes J. So depending on where I've shifted the alphabet depends on how the message is encrypted. And therefore, when someone else sees it, they don't know which alphabet I've used to encrypt this message, and therefore the message remains hidden to them. Now, of course, there are some disadvantages. First of all, if I was writing hello, how are you today, then the spaces would also be appearing in the encrypted message. So someone seeing it would say, this looks like a sentence. There are short words and longer words and there are spaces between them, but I don't know what it means. And that would give them a clue that they need to then try to crack this encryption. Also, there are only 26 different possibilities to move the alphabet left or right. And now if I was an army general and I had 26 soldiers at my disposal, I would just call them all into a room and say, right, here's an alphabet for all of you. Try to decrypt this message, and the first one that gets some good information out, raise your hand up. And actually they would do that in just a couple of minutes, so it could be broken quite easily. Of course, there are other weaknesses as well. For example, the letter E appears the most frequent in the English language. So if I look down my encrypted message and notice which one is the most frequent, I can then just line that up on my alphabet and I've decrypted the whole message. That's called frequency analysis. And of course, today with computers, this can be just broken in just a mere moments because it's very easy to crack. Now, one way to make a Caesar cipher stronger is to use multiple encryption alphabets, not just one. So here's an example where I'm using 5 alphabets. Now, if these 5 alphabets, if I take the key W, V, Y, What that means is I start with the alphabet that begins with W, then I use the alphabet that begins with V, and then I use the alphabet that begins with Y. And if we again try to encrypt the word hello, what we get is by looking at the W and then going across for H, we find D. Then we move to the alphabet that starts with the V and we go across till we find E, and now I get Z. And then I get the alphabet that begins with a Y, and then I move along until I find L, and now I get J. And if you continue on, you get H and J again. Now what's interesting about this is that now we've got the letter J appearing in our encrypted text twice, but J doesn't refer to the same letter in both of those cases because they've come from different alphabets. In fact, this system can be expanded to full 26 alphabets, and that was a system used by Vigenère in the 16th century. And it proved to be a very popular cipher, and in fact it was 300 years before it could be cracked. Eventually it was cracked by Charles Babbage, the famous inventor who invented the difference machine and sometimes is called the father of computing, but he didn't publish his work, and then a few years later it was broken by Frederick Kaczynski, who did publish his work, and the Vigenère cipher fell. Now, following on from the Vigenère cipher, we have the idea of a cipher that is completely unbreakable. That's both theoretically and practically. It's no way to break this cipher, and it's called the Onetime pad. Now, at the top level, you might have A, B, C, D all the way through to Z like before, but below, rather than having A, B, C, D, which is actually a sequence, we really know what's going on there. If it was a random sequence of letters, then there'll be no way to know what that random sequence is. And if that random sequence was as long as the message itself, then you are always using something random to encode the key. And if you never use it ever again, that one sequence is only ever used once, then there's never any other reference data which you can look at to try to find chinks or holes in the encryption. It's completely unique, and it happened only once, and there's no way of getting into it. Now, the problem with a Onetime cipher pad is that the recipient needs to have exactly the same pad with exactly the same random sequence on it to be able to decode that information. And because you can't send that over the internet, you can't send it through email or something, you have to meet them and you have to give them a pad, a page in a notepad which has got this sequence of letters in it. And then every day, every hour, whatever, you can change which pad you're using, you can change which page you're using, and once you've used a page you can rip it up and you throw it in the fire, and that's it, it's destroyed and it can never ever be recovered. Now, by the time we get to people like Babbage, we're now talking about the Industrial Revolution, the Steam Age and mechanization. And the upshot of this new industry was that encryption became mechanized, and probably the most famous example of that is the Enigma machine used by the Nazis during the Second World War. Rather than having to do encryption by hand, the messages were typed into a machine and it would pop out with the relevant encryption. Now, of course, that meant that the encryption could be very sophisticated with millions and millions of variations because the machine was doing the hard work. Now, of course, the Enigma was eventually cracked as well, and if you really want to find out something interesting in history about encryption, then you should study the story of the Enigma machine, not only the cryptography, but also the people involved and the history and the impact on the Second World War and so on. Now, after mechanization, we now have the age of computers, and this brings us into a whole new age. Now, computers are very different to mechanized machines like the Enigma machine for three different reasons. One is they're flexible. The Enigma machine was fixed. Once it was built, it did it only one way. You could change the key, but it only did the encryption one way. Computers are very flexible. We can write new encryption algorithms very, very easily. We can test them, we can discard them, we can investigate them more. Flexibility. Second, of course, is the speed. Computers are so much faster than any mechanized machine. And thirdly, and most importantly, we are now dealing with data rather than text messages. So even during the Second World War, it was messages that were sent out into the field about the war effort. But now we're dealing with data. We're not dealing with ABC, we're dealing with numbers, we're dealing with movies, JPEG files, we're dealing with video files, we're dealing with music files, we're dealing with databases, we're dealing with any kind of data that can now be encrypted, including, of course, our transactions on the internet. Now, when you start to deal with data, you start dealing with ones and zeros, with binary on and off. And you can group those binary numbers in together, and we might group them together as bytes or as 16-bit words or 64-bit words. We do that, But actually, ultimately, you're just dealing with ones and zeros. Now, in the digital age, as I've said, we're now dealing with data rather than dealing with letters. So the idea of a simple substitution that the letter H is now equal to the letter L and the letter L is equal to the letter J doesn't work the same now because we're dealing with data. Now, one of the key functions that's used in encryption is what's called the exclusive OR, and it's really a magical function. Now, exclusive OR basically means that if you have two bits, A and B, we want to know whether it's A or B, but not both. Okay, so one or the other, but not both of them at the same time. Now, what that basically means is if you have a 1 and a 1, the answer is false 0. If you have a 0 and a 0, the answer is false 0. But if you have a 1 and a 0 or a 0 and a 1, you get 1. Okay, so that's the way it works. It's a logical operation on 2 bits. Now, of course, 2 bits means, think about it, the top alphabet and the bottom alphabet. You're combining two things together. But the great thing about XOR, exclusive OR, is that if you run it again, you go back to your original numbers. You can try this at home. There are plenty of websites where you can try this out. So basically, if you do A XOR B and you get C, if you then do C XOR B, you get A. So it's backwards, it goes in both directions. In fact, actually, if you do C XOR A, you'll also get B. So it's really amazing. You can just combine these things and it goes back and forth, which means you get encryption and decryption. Now, of course, what you want to make sure is that the number you're XORing the plain text against the key is random or is certainly difficult to guess, so that you can't just XOR them back again and get the original information. In fact, if you just use a standard XOR on a key, it's very easy to break. In fact, there's a website you can go to, you just give it a file and it will just tell you in about 2 seconds what the key that you used is. So you have to use this in combination with other techniques. But it's really important to understand XOR, exclusive or A or B, but not both, not A and B together. Now, there are two main types of cipher in the digital age, the stream cipher and the block cipher. Now, the stream cipher basically takes each byte, or maybe something bigger, each unit of the stream of data one at a time. It applies encryption to it, passes it to the output, takes the next one, does something to it, passes it to the output. The data streams past the encoder and it deals with it in tiny, tiny sections. Now, a block cipher is different. A block cipher tends to deal with the file or the data as a whole. Now, we get the word block because it divides up that data into blocks, and the blocks might be 64-bit blocks or 128-bit blocks, and then it does encryption on those individual blocks, and sometimes the blocks interact with each other to do different things. So these are two different ways of doing the ciphers. Now, a stream cipher is more like the one-time pad. We're trying to have a sequence of numbers that we can apply to our original data that seems to be random. And the more random it is, the less chance there is of it being broken. Now, the problem is it can't be truly random because the person at the other end needs to decrypt the data, which means there has to be a starting point and there has to be a way of generating the same random numbers so that the information can be decrypted. So therefore we call it pseudo-random. When you look at it casually, it might look like random numbers. They're going up and down, the spacing, the frequency between them, it seems to be all over the place. However, if you wound up the same machine, plugged in the same numbers, you get the same sequence of random numbers out again. If you plug in the same key, you get the same result, and that means you can do encryption and decryption. But because of this, it also means that it can be attacked, because in the end, it's still a set of numbers that are being produced by a computer according to a function. And if you can work out how that manifests itself, you can then start to guess the keys. Now, RC4 was a stream cipher and it's been used for many, many years, and we find it in Wi-Fi, we find it on the internet, but it was using this pseudo-random sequence, and in the end they've started to find ways of attacking the random numbers in the sequence and finding correlations between the original data and the random numbers, and therefore they were able to produce some chinks in it. Now, today it's not considered reliable because under certain circumstances it can be cracked in a matter of minutes. In other situations it might still take years. However, it's now considered unreliable. When it comes to block ciphers, things are a bit different. There was a man called Feistel who was working for IBM on encryption during the 1970s, and he came up with the idea of a Feistel network. Now, a Feistel network takes all the data that needs to be encrypted and divides it into blocks. Then each of those blocks are encrypted using a key. Now, once they're encrypted, it goes round and does it again, and then again, and then again, and these are called rounds. And at each round, a modification of that key, a variant of the key, is used. So effectively, it's being encrypted again and again and again. Now, the idea is the more rounds you have, the greater the encryption. Now, basically, his work led to something called the Data Encryption Standard, which was basically the American government saying they wanted a standard way for computers to talk to each other, and so here's a standard for how to do it. And you had to have a key, it would then get encrypted, it could be then sent to somebody else in a different company, in a different department, and they would know how to use DES to de-encrypt it. Now, the problem with DES was that it had a limit of 56 bytes of key size. Now, in the 1970s and the 1980s, that was absolutely fine. However, by the time we get to the 1990s, non-governmental organizations had enough computing power to be able to break DES encrypted messages in a reasonable amount of time. Now, the initial way to get around this was to use something called triple DES, which basically meant that the data was encrypted 3 times using 3 different keys. And that extended the size of the encryption key from 56 bits up to 168 bits. However, because of some technical issues, actually the effective size is 112 bits. Now, that's still pretty amazing, because if you had a machine that could crack a DES message in 1 minute, and there aren't any, but if you did have a machine that could crack it in 1 minute, then to crack a triple DES message, you'd need 260,000 years. So that's still a pretty good encryption system, and it's used today a lot by the payment industry. However, the American government again wanted to produce a new standard for encryption, and so they started to look for a new algorithm. The result was something called AES, or the Advanced Encryption Standard, and that's what we use today. Now, it's also a block cipher. It also uses rounds, so it has rounds and it has keys, just like a Feistel network, but it's not a Feistel network. It actually uses substitution and permutations. Now, if you want to find out more about Feistel networks, DES, AES, stream ciphers, and all these things that I've mentioned, the written article that goes with this video has got lots more detail, more than I can cover in just this short video. And AES is what we have today. It's what we find in Android 5 and Android 6. And basically in Android 5 and Android 6, there was the option to encrypt the entire disk. So the entire disk was encrypted, and every single byte and bit that was done to that disk went through an encryption layer that could not be broken because it's with AES. Now, with Android 7, what we've moved to is now file-based encryption. So rather than encrypting the whole disk, the disk itself is in the clear, is plain, but the files on the disk are now encrypted, and that has 2 advantages. One is that the files can have different lengths of encryption. So you can have a file that's got very, very super encryption on it, and you've got files that have got good encryption, but not as good as the super encryption, and that of course affects speed slightly. And secondly, it means that only files, when they are opened, do they need to be decrypted, and they can be decrypted independently of each other. Now, that's Android 7. Now, when ARM moved from its 32-bit architecture in ARM v7 to its 64-bit architecture in ARM v8, it included some extra instructions to do with encryption. Now, because AES is a standard and the way it works is well defined, it's a published standard, ARM were able to put some instructions in the hardware that made AES quicker, because it was handled in the hardware. Now, because it's a block cipher, basically you've got these blocks of numbers and they need to be switched around, they need to be swapped about a bit, and you can do that in software. You can say take this bit here and copy it over there, and take that bit there and copy it over there, and that can happen. However, if you do it in hardware, you can just say, hey, do that thing you need to do for AES there, then basically it happens at the hardware level. In fact, you get a really good factor of performance increase because it's in the hardware. So therefore, ARM v8 has AES encryption built into it, which means 64-bit chips in our smartphones have AES built into them. And there you have it, my brief overview about encryption. Now, encryption really is a huge area of study. People do PhDs in encryption, so this really is just the minimalist of an introduction. There's loads more things that could be said. In particular, I haven't touched at all on public key cryptography. Now, if you'd like to see a part 2 to this video, please do let me know, because if there's enough interest, I will make a follow-up video which looks at the ideas of public key cryptography. Well, my name's Gary Sims from Android Authority. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. Also, please don't forget to subscribe to Android Authority's YouTube channel. Please follow me on Twitter and on Google+. Also follow Android Authority on Twitter and on Google+ and on Instagram. Don't forget to download the Android Authority app, because that will give you access to all of our news and features directly on your mobile phone. And last but not least, don't forget to go over to androidauthority.com, because we are your source for all things Android.